Good afternoon, good morning if you are on the West Coast, good evening if you are joining us from Israel. I'm Magda Teter, I'm the Literature Chair in Judaic Studies here at Fordham, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our event today. It is co-presented with the Jewish Museum in memory of Vivian Mann, who is a longtime Judaica curator at the Jewish Museum in New York. And she was also the head of the graduate program in Jewish art and visual culture at the Jewish Theological Seminary. This event is meaningful in more than one way. We're proud of our partnership with the Jewish Museum, which gives Fordham students free admission to the museum, allows faculty to bring their classes, and offers paid internships for our students. Integration of the Jewish Museum in our curriculum has enriched our students' experience immeasurably. It is also a very meaningful event for me personally. I have been interested in Jewish material culture and in integrating that aspect of Jewish history into my classes for many years now. When I was still at Wesleyan University, the local synagogue had a wonderful small collection of Jewish ceremonial art, and I was able to give students a hands-on curatorial experience. One semester, we invited Vivian Mann to teach a class on Jewish ceremonial art. It was a wonderful experience for students. Jewish ceremonial objects have been studied and collected for nearly 100 years. In the past few decades, however, their importance and understanding social, historic, and aesthetic issues in a variety of cultural contexts has begun to increase. And Vivian Mann was one of the most influential scholars integrating material and visual culture into the study of Jewish history. She started initiatives to ensure that the rigorous, and I stress rigorous, study of Judaica would become part of the discourse of wider disciplines such as the art history, and Jewish studies more broadly. Her work has shown how much more visual art and material culture can reveal about Jews, their culture, and then their relations with non-Jewish cultures around them. Vivian was exacting and often impatient with historians' use and sometimes misuse or even neglect of Jewish material culture. And I actually appreciated that demanding attitude she had. And in her work, Vivian was able to demonstrate how crucial it was to expand our horizons beyond the text, and how even the texts provide deep insights into Jews' interaction with art. Building on her legacy, today's speakers, Maya Balakirsky Katz and Laura Arnold Liebmann, will speak about ceremonial objects from the vantage point of their different disciplines. I am grateful to my colleague, Professor Sarit Katan-Gribetz, who has been organizing all these events and behind all these initiatives that we are experiencing and learning from this year. And I also want to thank the staff at the Jewish Museum and at Fordham, our Shovan Verletza. I also want to acknowledge the generosity of Midler Weissman and the Malka Fund for making this particular event possible. Special thanks also go to Roy Rubb of Topos Graphics, who donated his services and time to design the tribute presentation and the special invitations that many have received. And I'm also grateful to the committee that conceived this program, which consisted of Dr. Susan Brownstein, Gabrielle Goldstein, Sharon Mintz, Claudia Nachsen, and Judith Siegel. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to hand the screen over to Dr. Susan Brownstein, the Senior Curator Emerita of the Jewish Museum, where she was responsible for the collections of historical and contemporary Judaica, antiquities, and numismatics, and curated numerous exhibitions over the years, including, let me just mention a few, Israel and Antiquity, From David to Herod, Jewish Life in Tsarist Russia, A World Discovered, Dead Sea Scrolls, Mysteries of the Ancient World, As It Were, So to Speak, a museum collection in dialogue with Barbara Bloom, Repetition and Difference, and most recently she was the coordinating curator for the museum's newly installed collection display, Scenes from the Collection, which opened and many of us have loved it in January 2018. So Susan, without further ado, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Magda, for that wonderful introduction. Just get my screen up here. Okay, so our program today honors Vivian Mann, a towering figure in the field of Jewish visual culture, who sadly passed away 2 years ago today, according to the Jewish calendar. It was conceived by a group of her colleagues to celebrate the many contributions she has made to the discipline as curator, educator, author, mentor, and advocate. And we'd like to share some of those contributions with you now. Sorry. Vivian created numerous groundbreaking exhibitions while curator at the Jewish Museum in New York, bringing to life various Jewish communities through their art and ritual objects, religious texts, and historical documents. One of her main concerns was to convey the diversity within Jewish culture and the complexity of Jewish interactions with the larger society. For example, one of her first shows in 1982 was A Tale of Two Cities, which elucidated the similarities and contrasts between the Ashkenazi culture of Frankfurt and the Sephardi traditions of Istanbul. And here you see a, you know what, I don't know why. Okay, and here you see a picture of Vivian at the exhibition opening with the Turkish Consul General. Sorry, back. The Precious Legacy of 1984 was a poignant exhibition of Czech Jewish objects that had been seized by the Nazis to create a museum to a destroyed people. Vivian broadened the museum's profile by working as part of a Smithsonian team and the State Department to bring this story to American audiences for the very first time. Treasures from the Jewish Museum, which was co-curated with Norman Kleeblatt, looked at the collection from an art historical standpoint, showing how Jewish ceremonial objects and works of art were stellar examples of different aesthetic movements. Here you see Vivian with Norman and the director at the time, Joan Rosenbaum. An exhibition on the Jews of Italy, co-curated with Emily Braun, gathered magnificent antiquities, ceremonial objects, and paintings to tell the story of Europe's oldest continuous Jewish community. It was quite a coup for the then small but ambitious Jewish Museum to secure major loans from the Italian government, which was notoriously difficult, and traveled the show in Italy. With the exhibition Convivencia, co-curated with Geraldine Dodds, Vivian sought to challenge the common perception that Jewish life in medieval Spain was only a golden age. She represented the fluctuating interactions among Jews, Muslims, and Christians before the expulsion through the similarities and distinctions in their arts. From court Jews to the Rothschilds, focused on the complex history of Jews who became purveyors to the courts of Europe, while still remaining strongly within the Jewish community and religion. And here you see Vivian with co-curator Richard Cohn on the right, and Ralph Bush, who was a major scholarly consultant for the show. Vivian developed a keen interest in Jewish visual culture from Islamic lands. In 2001, she organized an exhibition that highlighted the various Moroccan Jewish communities of diverse origins, which both kept their heritage and adopted strong Middle Eastern artistic traditions. And here you see Vivian presenting a catalog to Kofi Annan, who was Secretary General of the UN, and his wife, Nana. After retiring from the Jewish Museum, Vivian created one last exhibition in 2010 at the Museum of Biblical Art in New York. In Uneasy Communion, she returned again to medieval Spain, this time focusing on the collaboration between Jews and Christians in the production of church altarpieces, for which Jews proved to be both artists and sitters. Each of these exhibitions was accompanied by a major scholarly catalog with multiple contributors, which provided enriched context for the communities represented. But Vivian's publications extended far beyond these and included dozens of journal and book articles and scholarly papers, as well as two important books. The first, Jewish Texts on the Visual Arts, published in 2000, is a seminal work that explores the varied rabbinical attitudes towards art and representation through their responses to questions of Jewish law. The second, a 2005 collection of essays on the history of Jewish art, is an invaluable compilation of some of her most important articles. And Vivian was also a co-founding editor of Images, the first American edited journal devoted to Jewish arts and visual culture. Vivian not only contributed mightily to the scholarly discourse within the field, she was also concerned with its continuation and expansion. To that end, she founded a master's program at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America that provided training for future Jewish museum curators. She was also an ardent advocate of the inclusion of Judaica and other disciplines, and among several initiatives, created a course in Judaica connoisseurship for staff primarily from general museums. Vivian was invited to teach and lecture throughout the world, and you see her here teaching at a curatorial program in Venice in 2017, which was organized by the Association of European Jewish Museums, and in discussion with a group in a Moroccan cemetery in 1999. She also traveled all the way to Doha, Qatar, when she was invited to be a fellow at a 2007 Symposium of Islamic Art. And she is the one who is all the way in the back, in the middle, but unrecognized, but recognizable, always recognizable. In addition to the many roles Vivian occupied in her scholarly persona, she raised 3 amazing children, was a doting grandmother, and maintained widespread contacts with colleagues and friends throughout her life. She will be sorely missed. May her memory be for a blessing.
Thank you so much, Susan, for this really moving tribute and overview of Vivian's amazing accomplishments and legacy she left to all of us. So I would like us now to move over to our main program with our speakers, Maya Balakirsky Katz and Laura Liebman. While they speak, I encourage you to post questions in the Q&A section of the screen. We will get to as many of them as we can in our discussion after they finish. I also want to assure you, and you can tell your friends, that this event is recorded and we will post it on our YouTube channel by the end of the week. So our 2 speakers are Maya Balakirsky Katz, who is Associate Professor of Jewish Art at Bar-Ilan University. Coming from the discipline of art history, Maya Balakirsky Katz is interested in the relationship between perception and the psyche, art and psychoanalysis, visual culture and religion. In her 2020 book, Visual Culture of Chabad, she studied the importance of objects and the visual experience in the study of faith communities. Her 2 more recent publications are Drawing the Iron Curtain, Jews and the Golden Age of Soviet Animation, and Intersection between Jews and Media. Dr. Balakirsky Katz is also co-editor of Images, a journal of Jewish art and visual culture, which was mentioned earlier. Our second speaker is Laura Arnold Liebman, and she's professor of English and Humanities at Reed College. Her scholarship, mostly in early America, focuses on the different voices within underrepresented religious communities and how they challenge the way we understand religious change. Her research often revolves around visual language and codes and material culture, and her latest work, The Art of the Jewish Family, which won 3 National Jewish Book Awards, which we were celebrating just yesterday, examines objects owned by Jewish women living in New York several centuries ago in order to recreate their biographies and restore their agency as creators of Jewish identity. So without further ado, I'm turning over the screen to Maya Balakirsky Katz.
Hello, welcome everybody. This is the absolutely largest audience I have ever addressed, which just speaks to how Vivian continues to command crowds. Anyone who professionally is invested in Jewish art knows Vivian Mann. I'm not entirely sure when knowing Vivian through her landmark lectures, texts, and exhibitions morphed into knowing Vivian in person, but the passage was seamless. I'm one of those people who feel that a relationship continues beyond the grave, a public confession that Vivian would have undoubtedly frowned upon given my work on Chabad. But much, maybe all of my work has been deeply inspired by people who have passed away. I was writing my dissertation on the Dreyfus Affair in my first home in Teaneck, New Jersey, where Vivian does have a connection through her son, when I met a nice Jewish man with a polite Russian accent across the street who was in the process of dying. We spent almost every afternoon walking up and down our shared road, talking about me. He was a little senile because he seemed to think that his family escaped from Poland in late 1940, which, being somewhat of an expert in this field, I knew was impossible. But I enjoyed our conversations on photography, European anti-Semitism, and religion. I thought he had a somewhat out of touch perspective on modern religion, but I was used to this attitude from older Russian men from whom I descend. The Shiva call for Rabbi Bar-Ilan, Rabbi, that was the first shock, given that I thought he was Russian. Rabbi Bar-Ilan was a moment of personal enlightenment for me. Apparently, this man was the last male scion to the 6th Rebbe of Lubavitch. Had the story played out differently, he would have been the one poised to be the Messiah. So I spent the next decade continuing those conversations. Vivian chaired the first session at the AJS in 2005, in which I presented my work, the first of my work on visual culture of Chabad Hasidim. That article, The Life and Afterlife of Rebbe Portraits in Chabad, eventually appeared in the journal that she, Stephen Fine, and Margaret Olin founded, Images, a journal of Jewish art and visual culture. We shared our first lunch after that session at AJS. She gave me advice. Maya, do not get pigeonholed as a Chabad scholar. Women who write on rabbis, which she did, have to create their own spaces. Taking her advice to heart, at my next AJS, I prepared a talk on Martin Luther in Catholic France. But a 20-minute snafu in getting my PowerPoint presentation to project, this was 2006, triggered an episode of stage fright I did not resolve for some years. We had lunch afterwards. Vivian shrugged at my public debacle. In the old days, she told me, art historians ran their slides on 2 simultaneous projectors. So technical failures were just part of the job. One must be able to put into words what could only be seen with the eyes, because most people can't see the stuff you're showing them anyway. Huh. Okay. Very Vivian and very true. In early 2008, we were together at a conference at Tel Aviv University. I presented on Chabad in America, which is the subject of today's lecture if I ever get to it. But we scheduled our days around the kosher restaurants in Tel Aviv. When we went to Poland together for another conference in the fall of the same year, I had just lost my mother and was in my 2nd month of mourning. I was terrible company, and I had no drive for finding good kosher food, and it was Poland. She and Carol Zemmel shared nightmares that were keeping them up at night. Carol said that the dead were speaking to her. Vivian said the food was causing her indigestion. I had just lost my mother, so I was like, will you be my mother? The other women at the conference, Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblatt, Carol Zemmel, and Gail Levin, were like, well, okay. And Vivian was more like, no, we're all orphans. Vivian taught the Hard Knocks School. But when we got back to the US, I showed up at her apartment in New York, and we traipsed around the city, ostensibly to see art exhibitions, but really to find good kosher food. And because every girl needs a mother. So this is why I decided to speak on Chabad's Hanukkah menorah today. This was the work over which I initially bonded with Vivian in our mutual interest in ceremonial objects as women who worked on rabbis, and which maybe even informs our sad and sadly difficult parting over the realities of death, but that continues to resonate, evolve, and grow. That's why we're all here today talking about Jewish ceremonial art, because we are continuing the conversation. And that brings me to Chani Lifshitz, the Chabad emissary in Nepal chosen to light the torch for Israel's Day of Independence ceremony last year. Also an anniversary we're celebrating tomorrow. Shortly after her public acceptance, a Chabad rabbinical court ordered her to retract, apparently without giving a reason. Jewish media sources reported the story with no more explanatory power, although the zooming out of that first photograph I just showed you seems to shift some of the responsibility to the seventh Rebbe of the Chabad dynasty in the background, the late Menachem Mendel Schneerson, simply known as the Rebbe. Chani Lifshitz wrote to the Israeli Minister of Culture, Miri Regev, quote, "This matter does not depend on me. I have been required to cancel my participation in the Israel Day ceremony, and I cannot enter the fire of argument." Poetic use of the phrase there. Miri Regev issued a statement expressing her incomprehension. Quote, "This was an opportunity to express appreciation for the contribution of Chabad houses, which provide a place to stay abroad for many young people from across Israeli society in all its diversity. The ceremony was officiated by 3 visibly Orthodox women." So what's the story behind, quote, the fire of argument? Gender may have played a role in the rabbinical court's exercise of power, and it's true that the Rebbe would have not approved of her participation. But the Rebbe's position on the fire of argument had nothing to do with gender. The Rebbe was trying to raise the dead before his own time ran out. Literally, he thought he could force God's hand in bringing about the revival of the 6 million dead by inaugurating the Messianic age. That meant reviving ancient Israel. That is, reviving the religious Jewish past in the present. Schneerson consistently argued that symbols from the ancient world remained relevant in the culture wars of the 20th century, an idea that Schneerson grew increasingly passionate in or about the last 2 decades of his life. Nowhere is this attitude towards redemption of ancient symbols more visible than in Chabad's dedication to the symbol of the temple menorah as a response to Zionist imagery. The use of biblical imagery and idiom in secular Zionist art was so central that scholars have sometimes referred to the aesthetic trends of leading artists of the Betzalel School of Arts and Crafts as biblical Zionism. Vivian was very fond of this image of Zevrabon's cover for Bar Schatz's book, Jerusalem Rebuilt. She had a glass-mounted slide made for those old turnstile projectors, so she was committed to getting the most out of it. Schatz is receiving instruction on the roof of the Betzalel building from the biblical architect of the menorah. Inside the book, Schatz envisions a reborn Jerusalem in which his museum was the future third temple that Jews have always longed for. According to Schatz, the contemporary third temple, the museum, would hold, like its predecessors, the first and second temple, all the treasures of the Jewish people. The Israel Museum is something of an heir to the Betzalel and arguably Schatz's messianic vision. The menorah was part of the museological concept from the beginning. When the Israel Museum announced its opening, sculptor Jacques Lipchitz announced his intention to bequeath 300 of his plaster casts to the museum. The Rebbe wrote to Lipchitz to dissuade him from making the donation, not because of theological concern over graven images, but because a secular art museum should not sit in the holy city of Jerusalem, he said. Quote, "The Roman Empire knew well that the most deadly blow it could deal to the Jewish people, was to convert Jerusalem into a Roman city." The Rebbe mentioned Billy Rose, who he called a showman, as one of those patrons behind the desecration of sacred ground, Freudian slip. Lipchitz reneged on his earlier commitment, although some of Lipchitz's sculptures did end up in the museum by other means. But according to the Rebbe, the desecration against ancient Israel was most visible in Hanukkah celebrations. After Israel's adoption of the menorah for its national coat of arms, Israelis adopted the design for their Hanukkah lamps. In honor of Hanukkah, the Maccabee World Union introduced the now popular fire torch relay from Modi'in, which was the ancestral home of the Maccabees, to Jerusalem. The last runner hands the torch to the chief rabbi, who then lights the first candle of the Hanukkah lamp at the Western Wall. Ironically, although not adopted in irony, the Israeli sports competition modeled the Greek Olympics, but adopted the name Maccabea in honor of the Jewish liberators from Syrian Greek rule in the Hanukkah story. For Schneerson, Israel's Hanukkah evoked Hellenized Jews, once again desecrating her temple. American Jews were inspired by Israeli Hanukkah leitmotifs, but generally limited Jewish holidays to Jewish private and communal spaces and conscientiously avoided public pageantry. American Jews preferred individual lamps and the domestic window ledge for the fulfillment of the Talmudic precept of Pirsume Nisa, publicizing the miracle of Hanukkah. When the menorah did appear in high traffic places, it was usually part of a commercial holiday display promoting gift giving as a small blue and white electric lamp under a much larger Christmas tree. Beginning in the mid-1970s, Schneerson advocated for the proud public celebration of Hanukkah in America. First, Chabad revolutionized the scale of the America Hanukkah lamp, promoting monumental dimensions for public lightings. Then, Schneerson expanded the traditional parameters of ritual space, sending his Hasidim around the world to erect public Hanukkah menorahs wherever they could find space. Chabad emissaries considered courthouses, town halls, and public parks especially desirable spaces, a preference other Jewish groups objected to and litigated against in court. Then, in 1982, several years into Chabad's public lamp lighting campaign, the Rebbe introduced the most decisive step for Chabad's Hanukkah campaign by linking the public Hanukkah lamp to the temple menorah in a unique visual way. The Rebbe claimed that the Zionist design of the temple menorah was morally wrong. Quote, "The drawing of the menorah on the Arch of Titus should bring a cry of pain because it was made to hurt and degrade the Jews. The menorah," said the Rebbe, "is supposed to serve as a symbol and awaken the Jews to their role to be a light unto the nations and to prove to the world that the Shekhinah rests with the nation of Israel. But they, the Zionists and the academics, make the current image of the menorah in a way that reminds the world of exactly the opposite, that Rome won over the Jews. Chas v'shalom, God forbid." End quote. Moreover, he claimed, the depiction of the temple menorah with semicircular arms was historically inaccurate. Quote, "If the purpose of their drawings is to recall the menorah of the Beis HaMikdash, they should revise their drawings." According to Schneerson, the famed Talmudic scholar Maimonides drew the correct design in the 12th century, and skilled scribes laboriously copied his original drawings. But the rudimentary printing technology of the early printing presses sent the images into obscurity. In Maimonides' conceptual drawings, the arms of the temple menorah do not curve as they commonly do in ancient and Byzantine coins, synagogue mosaics, and catacombs, but extend in straight lines from the base at 45-degree angles. Immediately following Schneerson's speech in 1982, and 4 days before the first night of Hanukkah, several Chabad patrons commissioned London-based sculptor Hirsch Pekar to forge a Hanukkah lamp according to Maimonides' drawing. Brooklyn locals gave Pekar the keys to a local metal factory, tools, and the materials to create a communal Hanukkah lamp in the new style for use in Chabad's Brooklyn courts. Working day and night and with the assistance of a constant stream of rabbinical students, Hirsch Pekar completed the menorah on the 6th night of Hanukkah, 1982. As far as can be determined, Pekar's 6-foot, gold-plated bronze lamp is the first Hanukkah lamp styled after Maimonides' drawings of the temple menorah, with some necessary modifications for structural stability. While the Rebbe continued to light the traditional Eastern European metal-backed menorah in his private residence, the Rebbe's secretaries installed Pekar's full-sized lamp south of the Torah Ark, as the menorah might well have originally stood in the Beit HaMikdash. When the Rebbe delivered sermons from the pulpit, the Rebbe, the Ark, and the lamp formed a triangular composition that some Hasidim interpreted as symbolic of the Rebbe's impending messianic role in the future temple. The expedition from Schneerson's textual revision of the temple menorah to its objectification in a communal Hanukkah lamp demonstrates the devotion of his Hasidim to objectify the word of the Rebbe. But outside of the sanctuary of 770 and an exclusively Chabad audience, viewers approach the Chabad menorah from a different perspective and in relationship to a different set of reference. Beginning in 1982, Chabad Hasidim began to replace the rounded-armed public menorahs they sponsored around the world with Schneerson's new design. For the broader audience, it marked a departure from the popular Zionist iconography that dominated the American Jewish Hanukkah landscape. The monumental, patriotic, and messianic Hanukkah lamp places both Chabad and Hanukkah firmly into the American December civic rights. The visual popularization of the Rambam's menorah, or the Maimonides menorah, and the development of a distinctly Chabad Hanukkah aesthetic allowed the movement to create a recognizable brand to universalize its highly particularistic message. The combination of a very public American Chabad Hanukkah celebration and a unique menorah design, easily recognizable and at odds with the prevailing styles, allowed Chabad to promote itself through a reproducible trademark. The history of the Chabad Hanukkah lamp reveals something of the role that visual culture plays in the Americanization of Chabad Hasidim, actually Chabad Hasidism, and the concomitant Chabadization of public Judaism. Okay, that's a mouthful. Chabad's revisionist design survives its rabbinical patron and internalizes its distinctly American roots. In 2011, Chabad emissaries in Israel commissioned the same artist, Hirsch Pekar, to perform his 1982 Hanukkah miracle, but only bigger. Pekar went back to the studio. It was then shipped to Jerusalem, where it was reassembled in the famous reconstructed arcade of Mamilla Mall. Pekar's 10-foot replica was lit at the Mamilla Mall in Jerusalem of 2011. The lighting of this enormous lamp no doubt continues the legacy of the Rebbe in public space. For me, Vivian Mann has made legible the broader conversation on the role that ceremonial objects play in Jewish life, politics, and memory, and her legacy continues to inspire generations of scholars. Thank you.
I'm going to go ahead and take over from Maya and share my screen. So, like many of the people who are here, not only has my work been influenced by Vivian, but the generosity of her time in the field has just been crucial for helping me develop as a scholar who didn't start off working in material culture. And I think, like most people who've presented on material culture at AJS, I had been on panels with Vivian before, but it was really when I came to New York, when I was working on the Art of the Jewish Family at Bard Graduate Center, that Vivian and I were able to connect in a different sort of way. And originally we had hoped that Vivian would be part of the discussions formally, as I was giving a lecture series at Bard, but then she became ill and she felt that she had to drop out. But instead of just dropping out, Vivian still continued to show up and continued to have those conversations with me about Jews in early New York. And one of the things that happened over the course of those conversations was really a continued conversation about what would happen going forward with the programs that she had built, who would be training that next generation. And while I continue to share those concerns, I think that our presentations today show the way in which Vivian's legacy continues to live on through her scholarship and through all the many people she trained, both formally and informally. And tonight I want to talk a little bit about a Montefiore wedding garment, and you'll at the beginning see how Vivian's work has been so influential on the way that I've been thinking about it. When Judith Levy Barrett Coet married Moses Montefiore in June of 1812 at Bevis Marks Synagogue, she wore a gown made of cream-colored silk, woven and hand-painted in China with a floral design. And while it's rare for early 19th century Jewish wedding clothes to survive, we know the details of Montefiore's fabric choice because when she and her husband opened the Ramsgate Synagogue in 1833 on their Gothic country estate East Cliff Lodge, Lady Montefiore had the gown remade as a Torah mantle. The transformation of elite Jewish clothing into Torah garments has a long history of Sephardic resonances, a history we know due in large part to the work of Vivian Mann, Barbara Kirschenbach-Gimlet, and others. In the Jewish Museum's own collection, for example, there's a mantle made from a man's silk waistcoat dated to 1784 to 5, though in this case the details were embroidered onto the panels rather than painted as the Montefiore's gown. This upcycled waistcoat is a really good reminder that artists sometimes deliberately invoked the previous lives of the fabric, in this case by transforming the decorative pocket flap, which we can see here upside down, into a Keter Torah. Referencing waistcoats carried weight. Long decorative waistcoats were a crucial part of 18th century elite manhood and helped create that pear-shaped, bottom-heavy, ideal male form of the era. Even in portraits of slim men, these waistcoats were designed to give this semblance of fullness. For Jewish men, the waistcoat's association with court fashion not only showed the wearer was dressed for the world of civic virtues and ready to cultivate the performance of politeness and espouse the causes of reason and rational thought, but also that he could serve as an intermediary between the realm of the court and Jewish ritual life. Jewish women were equally important parts of the sartorial upcycles, both as creators and former owners of the cloth. As Michael Held notes, ceremonial textiles played a central role in Sephardic women's lives, and clothing was often repurposed for Torah curtains and covers. In the Italian community from which the Montefiores came, elite women such as Simcha, wife of Menachem Levi Mushalami, took pride in creating synagogue textiles. When visiting Italy in 1839, Lady Montefiore and her husband took note of the, quote, rich and splendid silk damask embroidered in silk and gold for hangings in the synagogue, holy ark, and pulpit. Covers for readers' desks and the Torah were opportunities for families to honor women's roles in Jewish life, as Vivian Mann's own catalog of Moroccan Jewish art and objects demonstrates. Silver and gold thread on velvet and silk damask interwove the costumes of the synagogue and court, visually connecting the donors to circles of power. As Vanessa Paloma Elbes has noted, the association of Torah mantles and wedding dresses is similarly strong in certain Sephardic communities. The gold thread embroidered dresses worn by Jewish brides in Morocco, for example, deliberately echo Torah mantles replete with symbols of fertility. Although born into an Ashkenazi family, Lady Montefiore married in a Sephardic synagogue, and she joined that community by virtue of her wedding ceremony. Given these contexts and the fact that Lady Montefiore visited Mizrahi and Sephardi communities after her wedding and before her dress's repurposing, suggests that her later refashioning of her gown into a Torah mantle almost certainly was done with knowledge of this tradition. Yet, while most scholars who have considered Lady Montefiore's dress have tended to be interested in its transformation from a garment that covered Lady Montefiore's body to a garment covering the Torah, today I want to take a trick from Vivian Mann's playbook and do a different kind of approach. I'm more interested in the cloth's first life, the way the original dress negotiated Jewish identity during an era when Jews increasingly sought to enter British society. Judith's father, Levi Barrett Cohen, was an important diamond and textile merchant, and fashion was crucial to Judith and her sisters. By understanding the fabric and the dress's first life, I hope to deepen our sense of women's role as creators of British imperial identity. Given her family's role in the textile trade, Judith's choice of Chinese painted silk was significant. Chinese silks, particularly those like Judith's that explicitly recalled their Asian origins, marked the wearer as a part of a cosmopolitan imperial society, rather than merely part of court life. In fact, it's this role as imperial merchants and stockbrokers that gave Jews like the Montefiores their entree into that most British of circles, the aristocracy. Even when spun in England, silks required techniques that defied early industrialization and hence signaled the labor the wearer controlled. Fine silks were not only expensive to purchase, but also to maintain and required professional cleaning. The usual problems with silk were magnified when it was painted, as the chemicals in paint tend to deteriorate silk, causing tears. As Victorian Albert Museum curator Elizabeth Ann Haldane puts it bluntly, painted silk is a, quote, rather impractical dress fabric, and hence was not a choice made lightly. In this talk, I want to describe what we know about the fabric for the dress and silk social codes, and then turn to how these codes relate to Jewish involvement in England's international text trade. By looking at these contexts, I argue Chinese painted silks were a way that Jewish women negotiated Jews' role in the British Empire and their transition from outsiders to insiders. Dresses like Judith Montefiore's allowed families like the Montefiores and Rothschilds to negotiate the role of elite Jews in the era of global capitalism and industrialization. So the dress itself. Silks like this are extremely cross-cultural and speak to Judith Montefiore's self-fashioning as part of a cosmopolitan elite. As a couple, Judith and Moses Montefiore were very mobile and throughout their travels displayed a lifelong interest in silk production. Early on in their marriage, the couple visited silk plantations in Porto Reale, Malta, off the coast of Sicily, and later they visited silk manufacturers in Beirut. Moses Montefiore likewise was involved in the purchasing of silk dresses for his wife and maintained an interest in the duties placed on silk manufacture in the United Kingdom. One reason he cared about these duties was because in 1825, he became one of the directors of the short-lived British, Irish, and Colonial Silk Company, with which his brother-in-law, Nathan M. Rothschild, was also affiliated. This is to say, the Montefiore's knew and cared about the silk industry intimately. When it came to choosing the fabric for her wedding dress, Lady Montefiore chose to wear silk imported from China. Since today the fabric for a dress looks less than spectacular, it's helpful to reconstruct why such a choice would have been appealing. Typically, the patterns for the design would have been sent from Britain to China and made to order specifically for European buyers. Most likely, the outline would have then been printed on the back of the fabric and then painted on the front by hand. Besides being turned into a Torah mantle, three things have happened to the fabric since the time it was ordered, designed, and made. The fabric has torn, most likely due to the chemicals in the paints, particularly the green. The colors have bled, and the paint has dulled. Fortunately, a similar fabric from the Victoria and Albert Museum from a dress from the 1760s has undergone restoration and can give us a sense of what the Montefiore fabric might have looked like before it deteriorated. Comparison with restored fabrics from the V&A clarifies that that bleed that we're seeing in the Montefiore fabric was probably not intentional to the design. Restored fabric also gives us a sense of the vibrancy of the painting, both when worn and when the Torah cover was made, and of the initial elegance that such a fabric is suggested. Seeing the fabric closer to its initial glory both gives us a sense of that awe that guests would have felt viewing the dress, as well as potentially a sense of unease. Most of us probably have a passing sense, at least, of what Regency gowns look like, thanks to Jane Austen movies, if nothing else. And patterns during this era were smaller and the materials more diaphanous, similar to what we see Lady Montefiore wearing in early portraits, such as the one on the left, and other elite wedding dresses from the same era. The wedding dress on the right is from the exact same year that she was married. In contrast, the fabric in the Montefiore dress was either older than the dress or designed to look like it was. Patterns such as the one used on the Montefiore dress were extremely popular in the 1740s to 1770s, but less so by 1812 when Montefiore married. And to be clear, this wasn't about the wedding dress being plain, should have been plain and white, which is a fashion that arose later. So one possible reason for the deliberately antiquated style of cloth is the way wedding gowns were used during this time period. As Abigail Green notes and explains, such dresses were often passed from mother to daughter. And in fact, we do find 19th century dresses in museum collections that were created using contemporary dress styles, but using older silks, sometimes recycled from earlier dresses. If this were the case, perhaps the style of Judith Montefiore's wedding gown was more like the ones we see in her portrait, an empire waist gown in a neoclassical style, such as the 1812 wedding dress on the right of a Dutch baroness that's now in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. While it may seem odd today for an extremely wealthy woman to recycle her fabric, older style elite fabric signaled one's ties to old money and potentially the aristocracy. First and most obviously, reusing fabrics from earlier dresses not only signaled affective or emotional ties to previous generations, but also that one's mother or grandmother had also been extremely wealthy. It suggested the family had these sort of long-standing aristocratic leanings. Second, court fashions in the early 19th century were also deliberately antiquated, often with large side square hoops underneath, even as they were incorporating new elements such as the ostrich feathers and the empire waist bust line. The older style fabric used in the Montefiore dress would have fit with these kind of mixed aesthetics of such a court dress from this time period. Moses Montefiore wouldn't be first presented to the king until 1829, but court fashions suggested somehow the family already had been. The Montefiores clearly cared about court fashions. Later in life, when they had a reception with Queen Victoria during Passover, they noted in their diaries that their servants had transferred their court dress ahead of time so that they could be properly attired when presented to the Queen. Behind all these signals, however, was the very fact that the Cohens and Montefiore's had access to silk at all in 1812, and hence I want to shift to Lady Montefiore's family's role in the textile trade. Most discussions of Jews and textiles in 19th century England have focused on poor Jews. What I'm interested in today, however, is the role of Jewish bankers and businessmen in the British textile industry in those 1790s to 1820s, and their role as importers of cloth both from the British Empire and other parts of Asia, and as exporters of British textiles throughout Europe. As her husband and brother-in-law's role in the colonial silk company suggests, Judith Montefiore's extended family were key players in the British fabric industry, and her use of colorful Chinese silk painted with a Chinois floral motifs served to display elite Jews' cosmopolitanism and its relationship to British imperialism during these key decades. Judith Baron Cohen was born in London in 1784 to a Dutch merchant, Levi Baron Cohen, and his Dutch wife. Her father was the son of a Dutch linen merchant whose firm L.B. Cohen & Co. sold textiles and other commodities both in England and internationally. In addition, Baron Cohen seems to have traded in other wearable signs of luxury, particularly Brazilian diamonds, largely through contacts in Amsterdam. Even before Judith's wedding to Moses Montefiore, her older sister Hannah had solidified the family's role in the international textile trade through a marriage to Nathan Mayer Rothschild. And Rothschild's family were one of 15 Jewish families in Frankfurt that traded in British textiles. Nathan had been sent to England by his father in 1798 specifically to learn from the British business from Hannah and Judith's father, Levi Baron Cohen. By 1799, Rothschild had moved to Manchester to establish his own agency where he was trading in textiles. Manchester was not only the textile center of England, but also played a crucial role in the international fabric trade. Rothschild's Manchester-based fabric network reached across the Atlantic to the Caribbean and South America for cotton and wove that cotton into fabric from England, fabric in England, and then shipped the finished products into German, Swedish, Russian, and French territories, largely through Hamburg and Gothenburg. In 1806, Rothschild was successful enough in this trade to win the hand of Judith's sister Hannah. And a ledger book from 1809 to 1811 shows Rothschild's Manchester sales peaking in the summer of 1810, where he was selling about 20,000 pounds of textiles in 1 month alone, or roughly about 1.6 million pounds in today's money. Rothschild was able to do this because in the 19th century, Britain was producing half of the world's textiles, and Manchester and cotton were key to that success. At its peak, there were over 100 cotton mills in the town alone. Manchester helped democratize fabric, bringing cheap, colorful cloth to the masses using roller printing. And in doing so, it helped create an important shift in elites towards a different kind of fabric that clearly could not be mass-produced, such as the opulent hand-painted silk that Judith Montefiore used in her wedding dress. The fact that painted silk was a, quote, rather impractical dress fabric was precisely the point. It's a fabric that was both elegant and an ostentatious display of financial resources and access to luxury imports, including ones that were not going to survive in their current state for very long. By the late 18th century, classes were distinguished not by the type of clothing, but by the quality and costliness of the fabrics from which their clothes were made. In addition to Nathan Rothschild's role in cotton, his family was known for catering to the fabric needs both of elites and elite wannabes, and one specialty of the family was silk. At the time of Judith Cohen Barrett's marriage, the greatest impediment to obtaining European silk was Napoleon, who controlled much of Europe and was at war with England. He had blocked the exportation of both French and Italian silk to England, and indeed one of the greatest victims of Napoleon's blockade was the silk industry in northern Italy. Through his brothers, Nathan Rothschild had connections on both sides of the dispute, and hence was able to circumvent the blockade, or in less diplomatic terms, he was a smuggler. While many manufacturers in Manchester floundered, Rothschild was able to import fabric both from Asia and raw goods from the American colonies by chartering fast ships and employing special couriers who could bypass roads and ports blocked by the French during the Napoleonic Wars of 1803 to 1815. Precious in general, in 1812, when Judith married, silk was extremely hard to come by, and Judith's ability to wear it nonetheless signaled not only great wealth, but familial connections. It also signaled her extended family's new role in rescuing Britain from its enemies. Rothschild made a fortune in the Napoleonic Wars, but he was also a major financier for the British Army. And in 1812, when Judith's dress was made, the Chinois silk was a reminder not only of her family's power, but the centrality of the Jew broker to England's economy and freedom. Both families understood the power of silk and who controlled it. Hannah and Judith had provisions in their marriage contracts that, in addition to their future son-in-laws needing to repay the dowry if anything should happen to them, but that they also would maintain the women full control and absolute dominion over their wearing apparel and jewels of every kind and description. Likewise, shortly after Hannah's marriage to Nathan, the couple took out an insurance policy on all their household goods, including specifically their wearing apparel. Silk was used by the Rothschilds as wedding gifts and was a powerful way of displaying not only that one was aristocratic or wanted to be aristocratic, but that one was paradoxically both completely cosmopolitan and British at the same time. After their marriages, the Montefioris settled in at 4 New Court at St. Swithin's Lane, next door to Judith's sister Hannah and her husband, Nathan Mayer Rothschild. Starting in 1809, New Court had become both the Rothschilds' family residence and headquarters of their London business. But by 1816, the Rothschilds took the next step in their ascent into elite British culture by obtaining a country estate and moving to a villa at Stamford Hill. Later, the family would acquire Gunnersby Park. British country houses were not only seen as good investments, but also were a clear step towards achieving status and respectability. As with other country estates, luxury goods obtained from the East India trade, including silk, played a crucial role in decor. In 1831, the Montefioris followed suit and purchased the former home of Queen Caroline, the wife of King George IV, and the sister-in-law of the current monarch at the time of the purchase. Religion was key to this status, and for British Jews, country estates were a way to show Judaism could serve the same values of taste and decorum that Anglicanism did. Anglican elites typically had built private chapels on their estates, and thus, shortly after buying the Gothic East Cliff Lodge, Moses Montefiore had his cousin, David Makata, design a synagogue for the country estate. When the Montefiores opened the Ramsgate Synagogue in 1833, they featured that Torah mantle sewn from Judith's 1812 wedding dress. 4 years later, Montefiore was knighted, and Judith and Moses became official members of the aristocracy. Although after their deaths, the dress cum Torah mantle would eventually return to Bevis Marks for storage, at the time it was originally worn and repurposed, the dress was part of the Montefiore's transformation from religious outsiders to aristocratic Englishmen who played and were recognized for their central role in the British trade and empire. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to both Maya and Laura for incredibly stimulating conversation. So Maya and Laura, please come back on the screen. They showed us that there's much more than the eye can see behind the objects, and the stories are powerful and wonderful. So before we turn to the audience questions, I want to start by asking a question to frame the discussion and how our event was framed. So in 1932, Cecil Roth complained that Jewish scholarship has been over-concentrated hitherto on the written and printed word.
Can I just stop you for 1 second? Can everyone hear I'm in Israel, and this is the I don't know if you could hear it. This is the Yom HaZikaron.
Oh, should we pause?
No, I just wanted to just say it's like very timely. Okay, go ahead, go.
Okay, yes, I didn't hear it. So thank you for pausing for us to stop. So let me backtrack to, so in 1932, Cecil Roth complained that Jewish scholarship, and I quote him, has been over-concentrated hitherto on the written and printed word. He called for expansion of the source base for the study of Jewish history and culture, and was one of the first scholars to call for the inclusion of material culture and such history. He was frustrated that, quote, professional Jewish scholars are profoundly indifferent to those non-textual items and disappearing reminders of Jewish culture. In 2000, in her source book on visual culture, Vivian expressed the same sentiment. Sadly, she wrote, scholars concerned with literary culture ignore the evidence of the art and material culture germane to the very subject they are investigating. She noted that only in the last several years, a few pioneering cultural studies on Jewish subject treated both the visual and the verbal, moving beyond a limited conception of Jewish culture. In her footnote to that sentence, she included a mention of Ivan Marcus's Rituals of Childhood and Richard Cohen's Jewish Icons. So we're now over 2 decades past this comment that she made, and your own work engages with the visual and material aspects of Jewish history and culture. Can you now reflect on the change and the trajectory of the scholarly engagement with these types of evidence? In other words, the conversation continues. Where are we? What's the change? How far have we gone? How far do we have to go?
Laura?
Yeah, I think for me, this speaks to sort of that conversation that I mentioned that I had with Vivian, where she was reflecting on all the time she put into building the master's program and what was going to happen with the master's program and why it was so important to train people. I really do feel like, yes, we have a group of people who rely on the visuals, but we're still so much needing to have the kind of program that Vivian had developed, where scholars who aren't just doing material culture have that opportunity to learn how to work really closely with the objects and start to ask different kinds of questions. So I feel like there's a way in which we still have so far to go in terms of just making people comfortable with using the visual objects. I know I team teach in a course, and it's hard for people who aren't trained in the visuals to just take up an object and do something with it. So I feel there's that part of it. I would say places where we have moved forward, and just thinking about my own work, that this piece is a little bit exceptional in that I often work on women whose objects are, I'm turning to them because we don't have anything written by them. And Lady Montefiore actually wrote quite a bit. So she's exceptional in that sense for the women that I work on. But I do think that movement towards really being interested in members of communities for whom the object is all that we have, that shift, and like, how do we fill in a history through objects when we don't have the textual basis, that's, for me at least, been an important sort of shift, even as I do occasionally work on women like Montefiore, who, thank goodness, wrote plenty of things, even a cookbook, so, but I would say that attention to the diversity of women really has been important lately.
So I would say that from my experience, just at the beginning when I first started reading, scholars like Vivian, in the early days of like graduate school and today, is that we've really come a long way. That visual culture is now a accepted rubric for studying Jewish history, Jewish culture, Jewish politics. And I almost can't imagine a study that is only textually based to be taken seriously, where that just wasn't the case several decades ago. And, I think part of like what I'm noticing is that people don't take contemporary artists very seriously. And as historians, I'm not even like really like I myself am like just don't even know what to do with it. And at the end of the day, the artists are the ones that are like setting the landmarks in history, and everything we study in the universities end up revolving around their record. So I think that this, that it's kind of like a cognitive dissonance, because all the artists we know in our lives are like struggling and who knows what's going to be, right? And then 100 years later, it's like you just have your landmark images and everything is kind of tethered to it. So I think that I think that we've come a long way. It's not just images and Jewish art in these journals. It's also that kind of the most mainstream of Jewish studies journals and academic publications are including art and visual culture as one of their major, points of entry.
Yeah, I think Maya might be a little bit more optimistic than I am, because there's still a lot of textual studies that do not pay attention. But I do agree that there is much more sense of importance of visual, and I think part of it. I mean, Laura's your work on gender that certainly brings to life that there are, people are paying attention to non-literate, non-writers and going beyond. I think we're past that focus on texts. But I'll share with you, when I take students to the Jewish Museum, they are, especially after the change of the exhibition, they are sort of relieved that this is about art, and they begin to see the objects that obviously historically they were art, as you, Maya, point out, and then become historicized often in museums and become historical objects. They see this that there is art, Jewish art, and it's and addresses all kinds of needs, spiritual needs, reflecting cultures and conversing through time, right, with motifs, and whether it's accepting and continuing or challenging traditions and reimagining new ways of thinking. So I'm very grateful that this conversation does continue, and I think we will see a lot going on. So I have some questions and on the comments. Was there a tradition among non-Sephardic neighbors? This is, I guess, for Laura, but maybe not. Non-Sephardic neighbors of such upcycling, whether within religious communities or homes?
Yeah, definitely. So I think even the first example I used was a non-Sephardic one. So definitely within non-Sephardic communities during this time period that we see an upcycling, not specifically of wedding garments. So I think that's a little bit different. But yes, it tends to be a way during this time period of sort of, and Vivian, I think, actually has this in her book on court Jews, that it definitely is a way that that Jews were able to sort of demonstrate their access to sort of court life through those kind of upcycles of again, that kind of deliberately taking of what would have been the pocket of a very fancy waistcoat and then flipping it to be the Keter Torah. I take those sorts of moments to not be hiding the upcycle at all, but to be using it as showing like I'm still part of both of these worlds at the same time. So yes, we see that in Ashkenazi circles. One of the things that's a little bit more on the Sephardic side is, and even in the Ashkenazi ones, we see women taking part in the textile industry. It's very important in Western Sephardic communities, the role women have in creating the Torah garments and whatnot, even when they're not being recognized for it. And we see that in other Sephardic communities as well. But the wedding garment is definitely part of the motif in the communities that they were specifically visiting before they decided to upcycle the dress.
I find both of your talks, and that's growing from one of the comments of our one of our attendees about that both of your papers deal with really marking the boundaries between Jewish and non-Jewish worlds. And Hadassah Wiener, Chabad uses fashion to mark out a separate sphere. And here, your Lady Montefiore was doing something else in that is marking herself as part of the larger culture, but yet at the same time, then reclaiming that object for marking the Jewishness and affirming that Jewishness of that. So I wonder whether you could comment on that question of the spheres, of marking spheres, and in what you're seeing in both of your objects.
Well, I would also just mention Glenn Dinner's work, Men of Silk, as a preference of the Hasidic elite in wearing silk, and in Chabad specifically, the Tzemach Tzedek's, preference for white silks on Shabbat, and kind of like that was to set themselves apart, not just from non-Jewish communities, but specifically from mainstream Jewish communities. So, there's a lot more work that he speaks about that a lot more, but that kind of ties in with the silk, and not only to set themselves apart from broader culture, but also within Jewish culture, I would just say.
Yeah.
Right. And in some cases, I mean, Laura, I'm sorry. Yeah,
no, it's okay. I was going to say, yeah, so this piece I think of as part of a sequence of things that I've written that are about Jews and fabric and race and empire during the 1790s to 1820s. And I think of this time period, it's often a time where the way that Jews wore clothes, particularly in their portraiture, that people are like, they look like everybody else. There's nothing Jewish about this. And for me, it's so important how we identify what's Jewish. We tend to emphasize difference today. So like, I look for something different or distinctive about the Jewishness for this time period during the Emancipation era, when people are struggling for civil rights, and when we get the rise of scientific racism, which is trying to sometimes designate Jews as being non-white and being a separate race. We see this emphasis through fabric and through portraiture, through the way they're framing their bodies as sameness. And for me, that is so Jewish about this time period. And again, I think it's just an important way that we need to be cognizant of, like, as scholars, when I look at something, why am I always looking for Jewish difference, right? So, and that may not be the thing that's most important for the Jews during a particular era.
Yeah, and I think the other boundary, and that's what the attendee also was mentioning, is in case of Lady Montefiore, and I think both of your talks in some ways deal with that, but it's the question of repurposing or using something that is not holy to make it Jewish and holy in some way, right? And her dress is not, Lady Montefiore's dress is not the first case when women's clothing have been used. In fact, we have many of those examples from Prague, for instance, in the Museum of Prague, right, and other places. But I wonder whether both of you could comment on that kind of use of everyday objects for purposes that are, in fact, then made holy in some ways.
Well, with Hasidim, there's like really, kind of central examples, like using the blessed coins that the Rebbe had given his Hasidim and turning them into ceremonial objects. But I also just want to mention the notion of destroying objects, mundane objects, because, for example, Shner Zalman of Liadi, who was the founder of Chabad, believed that there was power in the objects that were used by the Rebbe. So when he believed that Napoleon to be coming to Liadi, that he needed to destroy those objects. And I don't remember exactly the specifics of the story, but he burned the house down, something like that, so that they wouldn't be able to get the power from the objects. Because even the most mundane objects, once it's been touched by the Rebbe and becomes powerful and has its own power. So in that sense, it also moves in that direction.
Very interesting, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just thinking about the kinds of objects I work on, the wedding dress seems to be less mundane than many, things like a teacup that I work on. So, but I think this is where Vanessa Paloma Albez's work in Morocco is so important for like remembering that the cycles go both ways, right? Like that because the way Torah covers are designed also influence or resonate with wedding dresses, right? There's a way in which the Torah tradition also elevates the wedding dress and emphasizes that the women's role as a sort of spiritual vessel and as a continuation of the people is part of that marriage ceremony. I just feel like in some ways it works both directions, right? That it's also sort of going back and helping us think through what do women's bodies mean, and what do their clothing mean, particularly in these transformative rites and their transformation, in her case, from being Ashkenazi to Sephardic, but also into marriage. And so I think as a rite of passage gown, it's not super, it's already kind of exceptional.
Fantastic. So we have gotten a lot of tributes to Vivian. So I'm going to put them for you in the Q&A. So you can see them. But Laura and Maya, do you have any other thoughts and comments as we're closing this wonderful, truly wonderful event? And I'm grateful to all involved who made it happen.
I think it's like very difficult to speak academically when in these moments, and that they're so personal. And I just want to thank Vivian's children and know that we're thinking about you in this time, and that that really just to express again what a powerful force she was in all of our lives.
Yeah, I would completely echo that as well, that I feel like it's really powerful to me how many people showed up today to honor Vivian, and just thinking about her lasting impact on us all. Yes, that it's really hard I'll get a little weepy now, but I think it's hard as scholars that it's a time right now where there's so much loss going on and we feel overwhelmed, but I feel like us being able to come together and really remember how enduring her legacy continues to be is just really important for everybody. So a big thank you to the people organizing this and to her family for allowing it to happen.